Marcus Chen never imagined that a routine security audit would shatter everything he thought he knew about his job. For 3 years, he had worked as a digital archivist at Westwood Memorial Park, one of Los Angeles' most prestigious cemeteries. His days consisted of cataloging surveillance footage, maintaining backup systems, and ensuring that the privacy of the deceased and their families remained sacred. It was quiet work, the kind that let him think, the kind that never made headlines. Until the night of October 14th. The email arrived at 11:47 p.m., just as Marcus was preparing to shut down his workstation and head home. The subject line read, "Urgent, archive anomaly detected." His fingers hovered over the mouse, exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. He had been at the cemetery since 6 that morning, sorting through decades of digitized records. The smart thing would have been to leave it until tomorrow, but something about the automated message bothered him. Anomalies were rare. The system was designed to catch them immediately, not hours or days later. He clicked the email open. The message was brief, almost cryptic. Unauthorized file access detected in Sector 7, Vault 12. Timestamp discrepancy suggests external breach. Immediate review required. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Sector 7 housed the most sensitive recordings in the entire facility. These were the files that documented celebrity funerals, high-profile burials, and moments that families paid extraordinary amounts of money to keep private. Vault 12, specifically, contained footage from June 25, 2009, through July 9th of that same year. Marcus knew those dates by heart. Everyone who worked at Westwood did. They marked the period surrounding Michael Jackson's death and the subsequent private burial ceremony. The king of pop had been laid to rest in the Holy Terrace section of the cemetery, in a location that was never publicly disclosed. The funeral had been intimate, attended only by close family members and a handful of trusted individuals. No press, no cameras, just grief and goodbye. The cemetery had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect that privacy, installing additional security measures and restricting access to all related footage. Yet someone had accessed those files. Someone had broken through layers of encryption and security protocols that Marcus himself had helped design. His hands trembled slightly as he logged into the archive system, typing his credentials with unusual care. The interface loaded slowly, each second stretching into eternity. When the dashboard finally appeared, his worst fears were confirmed. 3 video files from Vault 12 had been copied at 9:32 p.m. that evening. The access log showed an IP address he didn't recognize, routing through multiple proxy servers across different continents. Marcus pulled up the copied files, his heart hammering against his ribs. The first video showed the entrance to the Holy Terrace Mausoleum on July 7, 2009. The camera angle captured the heavy bronze doors, closed and solemn against the California sunset. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then the timestamp in the corner caught his eye. It had been altered. Someone had edited the metadata to make it appear as though this footage was recorded 3 days later than it actually was. Why would anyone do that? The second file was more disturbing. It showed the interior of the mausoleum, a perspective that should never have existed. The cemetery had explicitly promised the Jackson family that no cameras would be installed inside the burial chamber. Yet here was footage, crystal clear and undeniable, showing the polished marble floors, the ornate walls, and in the center, a bronze casket draped with red roses. Marcus felt sick. This was a violation of the highest order, a betrayal of trust that could destroy the cemetery's reputation and devastate a grieving family all over again. But it was a third file that made Marcus's blood run cold. The video began with the same interior shot, but then the camera moved. It wasn't a fixed security camera at all. Someone had been inside the mausoleum with a handheld device, filming deliberately, methodically. The footage panned across the casket, zooming in on details that made Marcus want to look away. Then came voices, whispered and urgent, speaking in fragments that were barely audible over the sound of footsteps echoing off marble. Marcus adjusted the audio levels, straining to hear. The first voice was male, older, with an accent he couldn't quite place. "We don't have much time. Are you recording everything?" A younger voice responded, tension evident in every syllable. "Yes, but this is insane. If anyone finds out we were here," the older voice cut him off sharply. "No one will find out. The family thinks we're conducting final security checks. Just keep filming." The camera continued its slow pan, capturing angles and details that felt intrusive, wrong, like watching something forbidden. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Who were these people? How had they gained access to a sealed burial chamber during what should have been the most protected moment in the cemetery's recent history? And most importantly, why had they filmed it? The footage wasn't a grainy, accidental recording of a security system malfunction. This was intentional documentation, created for a specific purpose he couldn't yet fathom. He checked the access log again, searching for any clue about who had stolen these files. The timestamp showed that the breach had occurred while he was in the building, sitting just 3 floors above the server room. Someone had been in the cemetery, physically present, while he worked late into the evening. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He stood quickly, moving to his office door and locking it from the inside. Through the small window, the cemetery stretched out in darkness, row after row of graves illuminated by soft pathway lights. Marcus returned to his computer and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of reporting the breach through official channels, he copied the 3 files onto an encrypted external drive. His instincts told him that something deeply wrong was happening, something that went beyond a simple security failure. If he reported this immediately, the footage would disappear into administrative review, possibly buried by people who had more to lose than to gain from the truth. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before taking any action. The drive clicked softly as the files transferred, each megabyte representing another piece of a puzzle he was only beginning to see. When the transfer completed, Marcus ejected the drive and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He would take it home, study the footage frame by frame, and figure out who had created it and why someone wanted it exposed now, 16 years after Michael Jackson's death. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, Marcus glanced one final time at his computer screen. The archive system showed normal operations, as if nothing unusual had happened. But he knew better. Someone had opened a door that was meant to stay closed forever, and whatever lay behind it was about to spill into the world with consequences no one could predict. Dawn broke over Los Angeles with a sky the color of old bruises, purple and gray and heavy with unspoken threats. Marcus sat in his apartment, surrounded by 3 monitors, a half-empty pot of coffee, and the growing certainty that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple privacy breach. He had been awake for 36 hours straight, analyzing every frame of the stolen footage, and what he had discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about that July day in 2009. The files were worse than he initially realized. Much worse. The metadata embedded in each video told a story of careful planning and deliberate deception. The timestamps had been manipulated not once, but multiple times, creating layers of false information designed to confuse anyone who might investigate. Marcus had spent hours peeling back these layers, using forensic software he had learned to operate during his previous job at a tech security firm. What he found underneath the alterations was explosive. The original timestamp on the handheld footage showed it was recorded at 2:17 a.m. on July 8, 2009. That was significant because the official burial had taken place in the evening of July 7th, with the family departing the cemetery by 10 p.m. According to every public record and news report from that time, the mausoleum had been sealed immediately afterward, with no one entering for any reason. Yet here was proof that someone had been inside more than 4 hours after the ceremony ended, filming with clear intent and purpose. Marcus isolated the audio track and ran it through enhancement software, stripping away the echo and ambient noise. The voices became clearer, more distinct. The older man spoke with what Marcus now recognized as a South African accent, precise and controlled. The arrangement is exactly as specified. Proceed with the documentation. The younger voice, American, replied with barely concealed nervousness. I still don't understand why this is necessary. The family was very clear about wanting privacy. A third voice joined the conversation, female and assertive. You're not paid to understand. You're paid to do exactly what you're told and forget you were ever here. Marcus felt his stomach turn. This wasn't an authorized access by curious employees or aggressive journalists. This was a coordinated operation involving multiple people with specific roles and clear objectives. But what were they documenting? What arrangement? He focused on the video itself, watching the camera slow pan across the mausoleum interior. The roses on the casket were wilting slightly, their petals beginning to curl at the edges. The floor showed scuff marks from the earlier ceremony, footprints tracked in the fine dust that somehow always accumulated in sealed spaces. Then the camera moved to something that made Marcus hit pause so hard his finger hurt. In the corner of the frame, partially obscured by shadow, was a second casket. Not the ornate bronze one in the center, but a simpler container, darkwood with minimal decoration. The camera lingered on it for just 3 seconds before continuing its pan, but those 3 seconds were enough. Marcus rewound and watched again, then again, each viewing confirming what his mind wanted to deny. Why would there be 2 caskets in a burial chamber designed for one person? Marcus pulled up the official cemetery records for the Holly Terrace Mausoleum. The document showed only one interment on July 7, 2009. 1 death certificate, 1 burial permit, 1 set of family authorization forms. Nothing in the paperwork suggested or allowed for a second casket to be present. Yet there it was, captured in forbidden footage that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. Marcus began searching through news archives from that period, looking for any detail he might have missed or forgotten. The coverage of Michael Jackson's death had been overwhelming, consuming every media outlet for weeks. He died on June 25th at 2:26 p.m., pronounced dead at Ronald Reagan Uckler Medical Center. The cause was acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication, administered by his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray. The world mourned. Conspiracy theories flourished. And through it all, the Jackson family maintained fierce privacy about the burial arrangements. But as Marcus dug deeper, he found inconsistencies in the timeline. Several news reports from early July mentioned confusion about when the actual burial would occur. Some sources claimed it happened on July 3rd. Others said July 7th. A few insisted the date was being kept completely secret. The official statement from the family only confirmed that Michael Jackson had been laid to rest at Westwood Memorial Park in early July, with no specific date provided. Why the secrecy around something that would become public record anyway? Marcus picked up his phone, then set it down again. He wanted to call someone, to share what he had found and get guidance on what to do next. But who could he trust? His supervisor at the cemetery would be obligated to report the breach through official channels, potentially alerting whoever had created the footage in the first place. The police would dismiss him as a conspiracy theorist chasing shadows in old security tapes. And going to the media felt like a betrayal of the privacy he had sworn to protect, even as that privacy seemed built on lies. He decided to trace the IP address that had accessed the files. Using tools that existed in legal gray areas, Marcus tracked the breach back through its proxy servers and VPN tunnels. The trail led across 5 countries before terminating at a server farm in Iceland. Dead end. Whoever had stolen the footage knew how to cover their tracks. But they had made one mistake. The timing of the breach suggested urgency, as if something recent had forced their hand. They needed these files now, after 16 years of apparent dormancy. Marcus pulled up news from the past month, searching for anything connected to Michael Jackson, Westwood Memorial Park, or the people involved in the original burial. Most of it was routine coverage of anniversary memorials and tribute concerts. Then he found something that made his pulse spike. 3 weeks ago, a former cemetery employee named David Kellerman had died in a car accident in Nevada. The obituary was brief, mentioning his 20-year career at Westwood and his retirement in 2010. It seemed unremarkable until Marcus cross-referenced the name with cemetery employment records. David Kellerman had been the night shift supervisor in July 2009. He would have been responsible for security during those crucial hours after the burial ceremony. He would have known who entered the mausoleum at 2:17 a.m. And now he was dead, just weeks before the forbidden footage surfaced online. Coincidence? Marcus didn't believe in coincidences anymore, not after what he had seen. He returned to the video, watching the handheld footage for what felt like the 100th time. The camera finally moved away from the caskets and focused on a wall plaque. The inscription read, "In loving memory of Michael Joseph Jackson, August 29, 1958 to June 25, 2009. Gone too soon, forever in our hearts." Standard memorial language, nothing unusual. But then the camera tilted down, showing the base of the plaque where the marble met the floor. Something was carved there, small letters barely visible in the low light. Markers enhanced the image, increasing contrast and sharpness until the words became legible. Truth buried, truth rising. 5 words that changed everything. This wasn't a random inscription or decorative flourish. It was a message, deliberately placed and carefully filmed. Someone wanted this found. Someone wanted questions asked. And someone else, Marcus was now certain, wanted those questions buried forever, along with whatever truth lay hidden in the Holly Terrace mausoleum. His phone buzzed, startling him out of his thoughts. Unknown number. Marcus stayed at the screen, debating whether to answer. On the fourth ring, he picked up. Hello. Silence greeted him, but not empty silence. He could hear breathing, steady and deliberate, the sound of someone waiting. Who is this? Marcus demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The breathing continued for 5 more seconds. Then a voice spoke, distorted through some kind of filter that made it impossible to determine age or gender. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Return the files and walk away. This is your only warning. The line went dead. Marcus dropped the phone as if it had burned him. They knew. Somehow, they already knew he had copied the footage, which meant they were monitoring the archive system more closely than he had realized, which meant he was in immediate danger. He grabbed the encrypted drive from his desk, his laptop, and a go bag he kept packed from his days in security consulting. Whatever was happening, staying in his apartment was no longer safe. Marcus drove through the pre-dawn streets of Los Angeles with no clear destination, just a primal need to move, to stay ahead of whoever had called him with that distorted threat. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, knuckles white, eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The city was waking up around him, joggers on sidewalks, delivery trucks making their rounds, the normal rhythm of life continuing while his world spiraled into chaos. He needed help, but more than that, he needed answers. The name came to him as he sat at a red light, watching steam rise from a street vendor's coffee cart. Nina Vasquez. She had been an investigative journalist before retiring 2 years ago, known for exposing corruption in the entertainment industry. Marcus had met her once at a cemetery event, one of those awkward social mixes where different LA institutions tried to network. They had talked for maybe 20 minutes about digital archiving and the challenges of preserving history in an age where everything could be manipulated. She had given him her card, which he had kept, though he never imagined needing it. He found the card in his wallet, crumpled but legible, and dialed the number from a burner phone he had purchased at an all-night convenience store. It rang 6 times before a sleepy voice answered. This better be important. Do you know what time it is? Marcus took a breath, trying to organize his thoughts into something coherent. Ms. Vasquez, my name is Marcus Chen. We met about 2 years ago at a cemetery networking event. I'm the digital archivist at Westwood Memorial Park. I need your help with something that could be the biggest story you never wrote. There was a pause, then the sound of movement, sheets rustling. Westwood, you're talking about Michael Jackson. It wasn't a question. Nina Vasquez had the instinct of someone who had chased stories long enough to recognize the shape of them in the dark. How did you know? Marcus asked, surprised. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because I've been waiting 16 years for someone to call me about that burial. Where are you right now? And are you somewhere safe? 2 hours later, Marcus sat in Nina's home office in Silver Lake, a converted garage filled with filing cabinets, whiteboards covered in notes, and more computer equipment than seemed reasonable for a retired journalist. She had made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and Marcus drank it gratefully while she studied the footage he had brought. Her face remained neutral as he watched, but he could see the journalist in her coming back to life, the way her eyes tracked every detail, the slight nod when she spotted something significant. When the videos finished, Nina sat back and removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone, not even when I was actively reporting. In July 2009, I received an anonymous tip that something unusual was happening at Westwood the night after Michael Jackson's burial. The tipster claimed there was a second ceremony, off the books, involving people who had no official connection to the family. I spent 3 months investigating. I interviewed cemetery employees, bribed security guards, even tried to get close to the Jackson family through mutual contacts. And I found nothing. Zero. It was like the tip had been a hallucination. Marcus leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. What made you believe the tip in the first place? Nina stood and walked to one of her filing cabinets, pulling out a thick folder labeled MJ 2009. She dropped it on the desk between them with a heavy thud, because the person who contacted me knew things that weren't public. Details about the security setup, the timing of certain staff shifts, even the specific location within Holly Terrace. They knew too much to be lying, but when I tried to follow up, my source vanished. Phone number disconnected. Email bounced back. It was like they had never existed. She opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings, printed emails, handwritten notes, and photographs. Marcus recognized some of the images from his own research, but others were new. One photo in particular caught his attention. It showed a man in his 50s, balding, with sharp features and cold eyes. He wore an expensive suit and stood next to a black SUV outside what looked like a hospital. "Who is that?" Marcus asked, pointing. Nina's expression darkened. "That is Harold Wexler. He was Michael Jackson's so-called security consultant in the months before his death. Officially, he was hired to coordinate protection for the comeback tour. Unofficially, he was something else entirely." "What do you mean, something else?" Marcus pressed. Nina pulled out another document, this one a printout of a corporate filing from 2008. Harold Wexler wasn't just a security consultant. He was a facilitator for high-net-worth individuals who needed problems solved quietly. His company, Sentinel Strategic Services, had clients ranging from Hollywood celebrities to foreign dignitaries. They specialize in three things: protection, privacy, and what they delicately call crisis management. The kind of crisis that involves making inconvenient situations disappear. Marcus felt a chill run through him despite the warm coffee in his hands. "You think Wexler was involved in whatever happened that night at the cemetery?" Nina nodded slowly, pulling up a chair to sit directly across from him. "I think Harold Wexler orchestrated it. Look at the timeline. Michael Jackson dies on June 25th. The media circus is immediate and overwhelming. The family is devastated, trying to grieve while the world watches their every move. In that chaos, someone like Wexler could operate with almost complete freedom. He had legitimate reasons to be everywhere, to make arrangements, to coordinate with various parties. And he had the expertise to ensure that nothing he did would leave traces." She tapped the folder with one finger, emphasizing her point. "I tried to interview Wexler back in 2009. He refused, naturally. But I did manage to talk to one of his former employees, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had quit the company under mysterious circumstances. She wouldn't give me details, but she said something I've never forgotten. She told me that Sentinel Strategic Services didn't just solve problems for clients. Sometimes they created problems to solve, situations that would require ongoing services and generate long-term revenue. She implied that they manufactured crises to ensure client dependency." Marcus thought about the video footage, the voices discussing an arrangement, the presence of second casket. "Are you suggesting that Wexler somehow orchestrated Michael Jackson's death?" Nina held up her hands quickly, shaking her head. "No, absolutely not. The investigation into his death was thorough. Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and the evidence was clear. What I'm suggesting is that Wexler took advantage of the situation after the fact. Michael Jackson's death created an unprecedented opportunity for someone in his position. Think about it. The family needed help with logistics, security, privacy. They were vulnerable, grieving, overwhelmed. That's when people like Wexler are most useful and most dangerous." Marcus pulled out his laptop and showed Nina his findings about the metadata alterations, the timeline discrepancies, the message carved at the base of the plaque. She studied everything with the intensity of someone reading ancient scripture, looking for hidden meanings in every detail. When she reached the information about David Kellerman's recent death, she stopped and looked up sharply. 3 weeks ago? And you found this footage how long after his death?" Marcus calculated quickly. "About 2 weeks. The breach happened 16 days after he died." Nina stood abruptly and began pacing, her mind clearly racing through connections and possibilities. David Kellerman was the final loose end. As long as he was alive, he could potentially reveal what happened that night. But he was also protection, in a way. The footage existed as insurance, something that would be released if anything happened to him. Classic dead man switch. When he died in that car accident, which I would bet money was not actually an accident. The footage was automatically uploaded or sent to someone who then had to decide what to do with it. But why leak it now? Marcus asked, struggling to follow the logic. If this was insurance, why not go directly to the authorities or the press? Nina stopped pacing and turned to face him, her expression grave, because whoever received the footage is scared. They are not interested in justice or truth. They are interested in leverage. They are trying to pressure someone, probably Harold Wexler or his organization, by showing that they have evidence. But that's dangerous. It's like waving a gun around without knowing how to use it, and it puts you directly in the crosshairs. Marcus felt the weight of her words settling over him. He had thought he was investigating a privacy breach, maybe uncovering some uncomfortable truths about cemetery security. Instead, he had stumbled into the middle of a 16-year-old conspiracy involving powerful people who had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats. "What do I do?" he asked, and was embarrassed by how small his voice sounded. Nina sat back down, her demeanor shifting from investigative journalist to strategic advisor. "We need to go public, but carefully. If we just dump this footage online, it becomes sensationalized conspiracy theory garbage that gets dismissed and discredited within days. We need context, corroboration, and protection. I still have contacts in the industry, people who know how to handle explosive material without getting killed in the process. But first, we need to figure out what that second casket means, because that's the key to everything. That's what they're really trying to hide." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. How do we find out what's in that casket without actually going to the cemetery and opening it? Because I'm pretty sure that would be both illegal and suicidal. Nina smiled for the first time since he had arrived, and there was something fierce in that expression, something that reminded Marcus why she had been so successful as an investigative journalist. "We don't need to open it. We just need to find out who it was intended for. Cemetery records are bureaucratic gold mines. Every burial requires permits, death certificates, transportation documents, payment records. Somewhere in all that paperwork is a trail that leads back to the truth." She pulled up a new document on her computer, creating what looked like an investigation timeline. "Here's what we know. Michael Jackson died June 25th. Public memorial service at the Staples Center July 7th. Private burial at Westwood later that same day. Then, in the early morning hours of July 8th, someone entered the sealed mausoleum with recording equipment and documented something involving a second casket. Within weeks, all footage of this was classified at the highest security level and hidden in encrypted archives. For 16 years, it stayed hidden. Then David Kellerman dies, and 2 weeks later, the footage is stolen and someone starts threatening you. Marcus stayed at the timeline, looking for gaps and connections. What happened between July 8th and when the footage was sealed? There has to be a window where people knew about this, where decisions were being made. Nina highlighted a period spanning July 8th through July 15th on her timeline. 1 week. That's how long it took for the lockdown to happen. I remember because I was trying to get access to cemetery records during that period, and suddenly everything became impossible. Security protocols changed overnight. People stopped talking. It was like someone threw a switch, and the whole situation went dark. The implications were staggering. Marcus thought about his own role at the cemetery, how he had been hired 3 years ago to modernize the archiving system. Had that been part of the ongoing cover-up? Was his job specifically created to ensure the footage remained hidden and controlled? The paranoia felt justified now, every coincidence revealing itself as potentially deliberate. "We need to be very careful," he said quietly. "If they knew to call me within hours of me copying those files, they're monitoring everything. Phone calls, emails, probably even this conversation if they can figure out where I am." Nina nodded grimly, "Which is why we work old school. No digital communications about this unless absolutely necessary. We meet in person, use burner phones for logistics only, and assume we're being watched at all times. I've done this before, back when I was reporting on cartel activity in Mexico. It's exhausting and terrifying, but it works." She closed her laptop and looked at Marcus with an expression that was equal parts determination and concern. "Last chance to walk away. Give me the drive. Go back to your apartment. Claim someone stole your laptop. You might get fired, but you'll probably stay alive. Marcus thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. My father used to tell me that the measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy. It's what they do when everything is on the line. And walking away is the smart choice. I'm not walking away. Michael Jackson deserves better than whatever this is. His family deserves the truth. And David Kellerman, if he really was killed for what he knew, deserves justice. Nina smiled again, that fierce expression that suggested she had been hoping he would say exactly that. Then we're going to need more coffee, she said, standing and heading toward her kitchen. And we're going to need to track down Sarah Chen, Wexler's former employee. If anyone can fill in the gaps about what Sentinel Strategic Services was really doing in July 2009, it's her. Last I heard, she was living somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, teaching yoga and trying to forget her past. We're about to make that very difficult for her. Finding Sarah Chen proved more difficult than either Marcus or Nina anticipated. The woman had gone to extraordinary lengths to disappear, changing her name twice and building a new life that had no digital footprint connecting her to Harold Wexler or Sentinel Strategic Services. But Nina was persistent, and more importantly, she understood how people who wanted to vanish actually accomplished it. After 3 days of searching through property records, yoga instructor certifications, and cross-referencing social media posts from former mutual acquaintances, they found her in a small town called Astoria, Oregon, living under the name Sarah Morrison. Marcus and Nina drove north in his car, taking turns at the wheel and stopping only for gas and coffee. They didn't talk much during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover. The coastline appeared through morning fog as they entered Astoria, a picturesque fishing town that seemed designed for people seeking quiet anonymity. Sarah's yoga studio occupied the second floor of a weathered building overlooking the Columbia River, its windows decorated with sun catchers and hand-painted signs advertising meditation classes. They found her alone in the studio after the morning session, cleaning mats and preparing the space for an afternoon group. She was in her early 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun and the kind of serenity that comes from deliberate practice rather than natural disposition. When Nina introduced herself, using her full name and former newspaper affiliation, Sarah's face went pale. I told you 16 years ago that I had nothing to say. That hasn't changed. Her voice was steady, but Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly as she continued rolling up the yoga mats. A man named David Kellerman died 3 weeks ago in Nevada, Nina said quietly, ignoring Sarah's dismissal. Former cemetery employee. Died in a single-car accident on a straight road in clear weather. 2 weeks later, forbidden footage from Michael Jackson's burial site was leaked online. And now the person who discovered that footage is being threatened by people who sound a lot like the ones you used to work for. Sarah stopped moving, her back still turned to them. I don't know anyone named David Kellerman. Marcus stepped forward, keeping his distance but making his presence known. I'm the person being threatened. My name is Marcus Chen. 3 days ago, someone called me with a voice modifier and told me to return files I had copied. Files that show something impossible happening in a sealed mausoleum. I'm not a journalist. I'm not looking for a story. I just want to understand what I've got myself into before these people decide I know too much to be allowed to live. That made Sarah turn around. Her eyes, Marcus noticed, were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. You want to understand. Sarah's laugh was bitter, hollow. Understanding is what gets you killed. Ignorance is survival. I learned that the hard way, and I've spent 16 years building a life based on deliberately not understanding anything about what happened back then. She walked past them to the studio's small kitchen area and poured herself tea with hands that no longer seemed steady. But you came all this way. And that man, David Kellerman, if he really is dead, then maybe ignorance isn't working anymore. Maybe the bill is coming due after all this time. She sat down on a meditation cushion and gestured for them to do the same. Marcus and Nina settled uncomfortably on the floor, forming a small triangle in the empty studio. Outside, fishing boats moved slowly across the river, their horns echoing in the distance. Sarah took a long sip of her tea before speaking, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the walls, seeing things that existed only in memory. I was Director of Operations for Sentinel Strategic Services from 2006 through September 2009. Harold Wexler recruited me from a private security firm where I had built a reputation for handling sensitive situations. He offered me 3 times my salary and promised me work that would be challenging and important. I believed him. When did you first become involved with Michael Jackson? Nina asked, pulling out a small notebook despite Sarah's early objections. Sarah didn't protest, perhaps recognizing that the time for secrecy had finally passed. February 2009. Wexler assigned me to coordinate security logistics for the This Is It concert series. It was supposed to be straightforward: venue security, transportation protocols, threat assessment, standard high-profile client work. But from the beginning, something felt wrong. Wexler was too involved, micromanaging details that should have been routine. He insisted on being present for medical evaluations, which wasn't normal, and he started having private meetings with Dr. Conrad Murray that I wasn't included in. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was confirmation of Nina's suspicions, testimony from someone who had been inside the operation. What do you think those meetings were about? Sarah shook her head slowly. I don't think. I know. In July, about 2 weeks before Michael died, I accidentally walked in on one of those meetings. They didn't see me, but I heard enough. Wexler was discussing contingencies with Murray. What would happen if the client became unable to fulfill his commitments? How quickly they could mobilize certain resources. The phrase Wexler used, I'll never forget it. We need to be prepared for the natural conclusion of our arrangement. He said it like he was discussing a business contract, not a human life. Nina had stopped writing, her pen frozen above the page. Did you report this to anyone? Sarah's expression turned self-recriminating, the look of someone who had been asking herself the same question for 16 years. To who? Report what, exactly? That my boss was having vaguely unsettling conversations? That I had a bad feeling about the relationship between our company and the client's physician? I had no proof, no concrete evidence. And honestly, I was afraid. Wexler had a reputation. People who cross him experience unfortunate accidents or sudden career-ending scandals. So I did what cowards do. I documented what I could, kept copies of schedules and communications, and told myself I was being paranoid. She stood abruptly and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the studio. From inside, she retrieved a small fireproof safe, the kind designed for protecting important documents from disaster. She opened it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck and pulled out a thick envelope, worn at the edges from years of handling. When Michael died, I knew. I don't mean I knew the specifics or had proof of anything criminal, but I knew that what I had witnessed was connected to his death somehow. So I made copies of everything I had access to. Personnel files, meeting notes, financial transactions, security protocols, everything that might matter someday. Then I quit, changed my name, and ran. She handed the envelope to Marcus, who accepted it with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of documents, some official company paperwork, others handwritten notes and printed emails. What is all this? He asked, almost afraid of the answer. Sarah returned to her cushion, her tea now cold and forgotten. Proof that Sentinel Strategic Services was paid $6 million by an offshore account 3 days after Michael Jackson died. Proof that Harold Wexler personally oversaw burial arrangements that the Jackson family never authorized. And proof that on July 8, 2009, a second body was transported to Westwood Memorial Park under false documentation. The room seemed to tilt around Marcus. A second body? Whose body? Sarah's eyes met his, and in them he saw the burden of knowledge that had driven her into hiding for 16 years. I don't know whose body it was. The transportation documents listed it as medical specimens for research purposes, routed through a company that doesn't exist. But I saw the delivery manifest. It specified a sealed container measuring 6 feet 2 inches long. That's not medical specimens. That's a coffin. And it was delivered to Westwood at 1:45 a.m. on July 8, 32 minutes before the timestamp on your forbidden footage. Nina had found her voice again, though it came out strained. Why would anyone need to secretly bury a second body at Michael Jackson's burial site? What possible reason could there be? Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the river as if the answer might be written in the movement of water. I've had 16 years to think about this. At first, I thought maybe it was a decoy, some elaborate security measure to protect Michael's actual remains from grave robbers or obsessed fans. But that didn't make sense. The whole point of a private burial was to keep the location secret. Why would you need a decoy in a place nobody knew about? She turned back to face them, and Marcus could see the weight of her next words before she spoke them. Then I considered something darker. What if the body in the second casket was Michael Jackson? What if the entire burial ceremony was theater, and the real interment happened in the middle of the night when no family members were present? But that seemed too elaborate, too risky. The family would have noticed discrepancies. They would have asked questions. Unless... She paused, struggling with the implications of her own theory. Unless what? Marcus pressed, though part of him wanted her to stop, to leave some stones unturned. Sarah's voice dropped barely above a whisper. Unless the family was complicit. Not all of them, maybe just one or two key decision-makers who were convinced it was necessary for reasons I can't fathom. Wexler specialized in convincing people that his solutions were the only solutions. He could make the unthinkable seem reasonable, even necessary. If he told the right family member that there were threats, that security required unusual measures, that protecting Michael's legacy meant doing something extraordinary, he might have gotten authorization for whatever that second casket represented. Marcus thought about the video footage, the voices discussing arrangements, the casual mention of the family's expectations. The man in the video said the family thought they were conducting final security checks. That suggests the family didn't know the full truth, whatever it was. Sarah nodded. Exactly. Which means some people knew everything, some people knew partial truths, and some people knew nothing at all. Classic compartmentalization. It's how you run an operation where different participants can't compare notes and realize they are part of something larger than they understood. Nina had been studying the documents while they talked, her investigative instincts cataloging every detail. She pulled out one specific page, a financial transfer record, and held it up to the light. This payment to Sentinel Strategic Services, the $6 million. The memo line says final deliverable per contract specifications. That's not language you use for security services or crisis management. That's language for a product, something concrete that was created and delivered. She looked at Sarah with new intensity. What was a deliverable? What did Wexler create? Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears welling in her eyes as she angrily wiped away. I don't know. That's the truth. I don't know what Wexler delivered or to whom or why it was worth $6 million. But I know it required a doctor's participation, secret access to a burial site, falsified documentation, and absolute secrecy. And I know that every person who got too close to finding out has either been silenced or disappeared. David Kellerman is just the latest. There were others before him. A medical examiner who asked too many questions about the autopsy findings died of a sudden heart attack in 2010. A journalist in London who was investigating financial irregularities surrounding Michael's estate was killed in a hit-and-run in 2012. A cemetery security guard who tried to blackmail someone with information he had quit his job and vanished in 2015. The pattern is clear if you know to look for it. Marcus felt cold despite the warm sunlight streaming through the studio windows. You're saying there's been a 16-year campaign to protect whatever secret is in that mausoleum. Sarah shook her head. Not just to protect it, to maintain it. Secrets die without maintenance. They require constant attention, constant monitoring, constant adjustment as circumstances change. Someone has been actively managing the situation for 16 years, which suggests the secret isn't just historical. It's ongoing. It matters now as much as it mattered then. Nina stood and began pacing, a habit Marcus had noticed she reverted to when thinking through complex problems. The footage surfacing now, after David Kellerman's death, suggests his insurance policy worked exactly as intended. Someone received evidence and decided to use it, but not to expose the truth, to threaten exposure. That's different. That means whoever has the footage wants something from Wexler or his organization. She stopped pacing and looked at Marcus. We need to figure out who received Kellerman's insurance policy. That person is a key to everything. Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened the encrypted files, showing Sarah the footage she had never seen but had been running from for 16 years. Her face remained carefully neutral as she watched, but he saw recognition in her eyes when the voices began speaking. That's Wexler, she confirmed, pointing at the screen when the older male voice issued instructions. I'd recognize that voice anywhere. The younger one is probably James Pritchard, one of our field operatives. He was always uncomfortable with the gray area work. And the woman. She paused, listening more carefully. I don't recognize her. She wasn't company personnel, at least not anyone I work with. The revelation that Wexler himself was present in the mausoleum at 2 a.m. on July 8th was significant. It confirmed this wasn't a rogue operation by subordinates. This was deliberate action by the head of Sentinel Strategic Services, which meant it had been planned at the highest level. Is Wexler still alive? Marcus asked. Sarah nodded slowly. As far as I know, he sold Sentinel Strategic Services in 2018 and retired to somewhere in the Caribbean. But retirement for someone like Wexler doesn't mean he stopped working. It just means he stopped doing it publicly. Nina made a decision, the kind Marcus recognized from their few days working together as both brilliant and dangerous. We need to contact Wexler directly, not to threaten him, but to offer him a deal. We have evidence of his involvement in whatever happened at that mausoleum. Whoever stole that footage from Marcus's archive also has evidence. They are going to use it to pressure him, probably demanding money or protection or leverage for something else. We position ourselves as an alternative. We offer to keep the footage private in exchange for the truth, the full truth about what's in that second casket and why it matters. Sarah looked horrified. You can't contact Harold Wexler. That's suicide. He doesn't negotiate, he eliminates. The moment you reach out to him, you become a confirmed threat that needs to be removed. But Nina's expression was determined, almost excited. Is already eliminating. David Kellerman is dead. Marcus is being threatened. The insurance policy is in play, which means Wexler's current situation is unstable. Unstable situations create opportunities. People make mistakes when they're managing multiple threats simultaneously. We become one more variable in an equation he can't perfectly control. Marcus wasn't sure he liked being described as a variable in someone else's equation, especially an equation that involved multiple murders and a 16-year conspiracy. But Nina had a point. Sitting around waiting for Wexler's people to find them was passive suicide. Taking action, forcing the situation to move forward, at least gave them some agency in their own survival. How do we contact someone who doesn't want to be found? He asked. Sarah sighed deeply, the sound of someone watching her carefully constructed piece being demolished. I can find him. I've kept tabs over the years, just in case. Self-preservation. If you're really going to do this insane thing, I'll help you make contact. But I want immunity. Whatever happens, whatever you discover, my name stays out of it. I've earned my quiet life, and I'm not giving it up to be the public face of exposing Harold Wexler. Nina agreed immediately, and Marcus nodded his consent. They spent the next 3 hours in Sarah's studio, going through every document in the envelope, building a timeline of events that painted a picture of coordination and conspiracy. The paper trail showed that Sentinel Strategic Services had been involved in Michael Jackson's affairs for longer than publicly known, going back to at least 2007. There were payments disguised as security consulting fees, but the amounts and frequency suggested something more substantial. Someone had been paying Wexler's company enormous sums of money for years, and Michael Jackson's death hadn't ended that relationship. If anything, the payments had increased. Who was paying? Marcus asked, studying a financial document that showed a transfer of $2 million in November 2009, months after burial. Sarah pointed to the account number. That's routed through 3 different shell companies, but I did some digging back when I first compiled these documents. The money ultimately originates from the Michael Jackson estate, which means someone with authority over the estate was continuing to pay Sentinel Strategic Services long after Michael was dead. The question is, were they paying for past services or for ongoing silence? The implications were staggering. If the estate itself was involved in maintaining whatever secret existed in that mausoleum, then this conspiracy reached far beyond Harold Wexler. It touched on inheritance, legacy, and potentially billions of dollars in ongoing revenue from Michael Jackson's music and image. We're going to need protection, Marcus said quietly. If we're going up against estate lawyers, private security companies, and people who have been covering this up for 16 years, we need someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Nina pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts she had maintained from her reporting days. I know a federal prosecutor who specializes in complex fraud cases. She's incorruptible, ambitious, and she hates unsolved mysteries. If we give her enough to justify opening an investigation, she can provide protection and subpoena power. But we need more than circumstantial evidence and old financial records. We need something concrete that proves a crime was committed. She looked at Marcus. That means we need to know what's in that second casket. The room fell silent as they all contemplated the impossible task. They couldn't physically access the mausoleum without breaking multiple laws and likely getting killed in the process. The official cemetery records would have been sanitized years ago, and anyone who might have direct knowledge was either dead or too terrified to speak. There might be one other option, Sarah said slowly, reluctantly. James Pritchard, the young operative whose voice is in the video. He left Sentinel Strategic Services in 2010, around the same time I did. Last I heard, he was living in Arizona, working as a private investigator. If anyone besides Wexler knows what happened inside that mausoleum, it's Pritchard. He was there. He filmed it. He saw whatever is in that second casket. Nina was already on her feet, energized by the possibility. Do you have contact information for him? Sarah shook her head. Not current, but I can find him. Give me a few hours. Marcus stood as well, his body aching from sitting on the floor and from 3 days of constant adrenaline. What if Pritchard doesn't want to talk? What if he's as committed to keeping this secret as Wexler is? Sarah walked them to the door, her hand resting briefly on Marcus's shoulder. Then we'll know we're dealing with something so devastating that even people who want it out felt compelled to protect it. And that will tell us more than any confession ever could. They left Astoria as the sun began setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for the darkness they were uncovering. Marcus drove while Nina worked her phone, making careful calls to contacts, laying groundwork for the explosive story they were building. In the backseat, Sarah's envelope full of documents represented 16 years of guilt, fear, and the hope that someday the truth would matter more than survival. That someday had apparently arrived, whether any of them were ready for it or not. James Pritchard lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Sedona, Arizona, surrounded by red rock formations that seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. It had taken Sarah 2 days to locate him, and another day for Marcus and Nina to drive from Oregon to Arizona, pushing Marcus's car to its limits and stopping only when absolutely necessary. They arrived exhausted, nervous, and carrying the weight of everything they had learned. The house looked peaceful, almost aggressively normal, with a well-maintained garden and a pickup truck in the driveway. It was hard to imagine that the man who lived here had witnessed something so significant that people had been dying to protect it for 16 years. Pritchard answered the door on the second knock, and Marcus immediately recognized him from the voice in the video. He was in his late 40s now, with a weathered look of someone who spent time outdoors and the cautious eyes of someone who had learned to expect trouble. When Nina introduced herself and mentioned Sentinel Strategic Services, those eyes went flat and dangerous. I don't know what you're talking about. You have the wrong person. He started to close the door, but Marcus spoke quickly, urgently. We have the footage from July 8th, 2009. We know you were there. We know you filmed what happened in the Holly Terrace Mausoleum. And we know that David Kellerman is dead because of what he knew. The door stopped moving. Pritchard stood frozen for a long moment, then stepped back and gestured them inside with a resignation that suggested he had been expecting this conversation for years. The interior of his house was sparse, functional, decorated with Southwest art and photographs of desert landscapes. But Marcus noticed the security measures immediately, cameras in every corner, reinforced doors, windows with internal bars. This was a man who lived in constant awareness that his past might catch up with him. How did you find me? Pritchard asked, not bothering to deny anything now that they were inside. Sarah Chen gave us your name, Nina said, settling onto a leather couch without waiting for an invitation. She's been carrying her own secrets for 16 years. She decided it was time to stop running. Pritchard's expression shifted through several emotions, surprise, concern, and something that might have been relief. Sarah's alive? I always wondered. After she quit, she vanished so completely I thought maybe Wexler had. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They all knew what he thought Wexler had done. Marcus pulled out his laptop and showed Pritchard the footage. "This is you, isn't it? July 8, 2009, approximately 2:17 a.m. You're inside the mausoleum where Michael Jackson was buried, filming something with Harold Wexler present." Pritchard watched the screen, his face carefully neutral, but Marcus saw his hands clenching and unclenching, a physical response to memories that clearly still caused distress. When the video ended, Pritchard stood and walked to his kitchen, pouring himself bourbon from a bottle that looked well used. He didn't offer them any. "I've lived with this for 16 years, Pritchard said finally, staring into his glass. "I've imagined this conversation 1,000 times. How I would deny everything, how I would protect myself, how I would keep the secret, because keeping it meant staying alive. But David's dead now. Kellerman. I didn't know him personally, but I know what his death means. It means the situation is deteriorating. It means Wexler is cleaning house, removing anyone who might talk, which means I'm already on borrowed time. So yeah, that's me in the video. And yeah, I know what's in that second casket. And I've been waiting for someone brave or stupid enough to come here and ask me about it." Nina leaned forward, every instinct of her journalistic training focused on this moment. "What's in the casket? James? What did you see that night?" Pritchard drained his bourbon in one swallow and poured another. "I need you to understand something first. I was 29 years old when this happened. I had been working for Sentinel Strategic Services for 3 years. I thought I was doing important work, protecting important people. Wexler was my mentor, someone I respected and trusted. When he asked me to be part of a sensitive operation involving Michael Jackson's burial, I felt honored. I didn't question it. I should have, but I didn't." He sat back down, no longer looking at them but at something in the distance, some memory that had been replaying in his mind for 16 years. The official burial happened on July 7th, just like everyone knows. The family was there. The ceremony was private and respectful, and Michael Jackson was laid to rest in that bronze casket with the red roses. Everything about that was real. The family left around 10 p.m., believing their loved one was finally at peace. What they didn't know was that the burial permit had been written to allow for maintenance access within 72 hours, a technicality that Wexler had specifically arranged. Marcus felt his heart pounding. What kind of maintenance? Pritchard's laugh was bitter, self-recriminating. The kind that requires a doctor, a funeral director who doesn't ask questions, and people like me to document everything for legal protection. At 1:45 a.m. on July 8, a second casket arrived at the cemetery. It was transported in an unmarked vehicle, accompanied by Dr. Conrad Murray and 2 other people I didn't recognize. They brought it directly to the mausoleum. Wexler and I were already there, having opened the sealed chamber using access codes the family didn't know he had. Nina's hand had stopped writing. Her pen hovered above the page as if afraid to record what came next. James, whose body was in the second casket. Pritchard met her eyes directly for the first time, and in his gaze Marcus saw guilt, horror, and the crushing weight of knowledge that had destroyed any peace he might have found in 16 years. There was no body in the second casket when it arrived. It was empty. We were there to fill it. The words hung in the air like smoke, toxic and suffocating. Marcus struggled to understand what he was hearing. "What do you mean? Fill it? Fill it with what?" Pritchard stood again, unable to sit still with these memories. He walked to his window, looking out at the red rocks that had become his refuge from a past that wouldn't release him. The bronze casket, the one everyone saw at the ceremony, the one with the red roses. We opened it. Wexler had a key. I didn't ask how he got it. We opened it, and inside was Michael Jackson's body, exactly as you would expect. He was dressed in the outfit the family had chosen. He looked at peace. And then Dr. Murray examined him. Examined him for what? Nina demanded, her voice sharp with growing horror. Pritchard turned back to face them, and tears were running down his face. To verify something. Murray used instruments I didn't understand, took measurements, checked things I couldn't see clearly. And then he nodded to Wexler. Whatever he had been looking for, he had found it or confirmed it. And that's when they did the unthinkable. They removed Michael Jackson's body from the bronze casket and placed it in the plain wooden one we had brought. The room seemed to lose oxygen. Marcus stood abruptly, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. That's impossible. Why would anyone do that? What possible reason could there be to move a body hours after burial? Pritchard wiped his face roughly with his sleeve. I asked the same question. Wexler told me it was for security purposes, that there had been credible threats against the integrity of the remains, that this swap was necessary to protect Michael's final rest. He said the family had been informed and had approved, though they wanted absolute secrecy. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was accepting that I was participating in something monstrously wrong. Nina had found her voice again, though it trembled. Where did they take Michael Jackson's actual body? Pritchard walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a small notebook, worn and stained as if it had been handled countless times. I kept notes. Against every protocol, against every order Wexler gave me, I kept notes. Because even then, I knew something was deeply wrong. According to the transportation documents I saw, the wooden casket with Michael's body was taken to a medical facility in Nevada, a private research center that supposedly specialized in preservation techniques. The paperwork said it was for experimental mummification, preservation of remains for long-term viewing, something about honoring Michael's legacy with cutting-edge preservation science. Marcus sat back down heavily, his legs unable to support him. But that's not what really happened, is it? Pritchard shook his head. I don't know what really happened. That's the truth. I documented everything I saw in that mausoleum. I recorded the conversations. I noted the transportation details. Then Wexler paid me $100,000 in cash and told me to forget everything I had witnessed. He said that if I ever spoke about this to anyone, I would be considered complicit in criminal activity and would spend the rest of my life in prison. He also made it very clear that prison would be preferable to what would happen to me if his employers decided I was a liability. He opened the notebook and handed it to Nina. Inside were detailed entries, times, names, descriptions, everything a trained operative would record as evidence or insurance. I've been carrying this for 16 years. I've moved 7 times, changed my name 3 times, and learned to live looking over my shoulder. I quit Sentinel Strategic Services 2 months after that night because I couldn't stomach working for Wexler anymore. But I kept the notebook because it was my insurance policy. If anything happened to me, I had arranged for it to be sent to several journalists, including you, Nina. I remembered your name from when Wexler mentioned you as someone who was asking too many questions in 2009. Nina stared at the notebook as if it were a holy relic. Why didn't you come forward before now? 16 years, James. Michael Jackson's children grew up without their father. His fans mourned at a grave that might not even contain his remains. Why stay silent? Pritchard's face crumpled. Because I'm a coward. Because I was afraid. Because every time I convinced myself to go to the authorities, I would remember that Dr. Murray was convicted and sentenced for Michael's death. The official story was sealed, confirmed, legally adjudicated. If I came forward saying the burial was a fraud, I would be calling the entire investigation into question. And the forces that orchestrated this swap, they were powerful enough to arrange all of it under the noses of family, media, and law enforcement. What chance did I have against that? Marcus thought about the carved message at the base of the memorial plaque. Truth buried, truth rising. Someone else knew besides you. Someone carved those words into the mausoleum. Was that you? Pritchard nodded slowly. I did that before we sealed the chamber that night. It was stupid, reckless, but I needed to believe that somehow, someday, the truth would matter. That someone would ask questions and find answers. Kellerman knew something was wrong, too. He was a night supervisor. He saw the transportation, saw us accessing the mausoleum at unauthorized hours. I think Wexler paid him off, too, gave him his own insurance policy to keep quiet, and now he's dead for it. Nina was furiously copying pages from the notebook, her hand racing across her own notepad. This Nevada facility, the research center, do you know if it still exists? Pritchard walked to his computer and pulled up a website bookmarked in a folder labeled simply Evidence. It's called the Prometheus Institute. It's a private medical research facility specializing in cryonics, genetic preservation, and what they call biological immortality research. It's funded by some of the wealthiest people in the world, people obsessed with extending life or preserving consciousness. And it's completely legal, operating under scientific research exemptions that allow them to maintain biological materials that would otherwise require strict chain of custody documentation. Marcus looked at the website, reading descriptions of services that sounded like science fiction. The preservation of human remains at cellular temperatures, the maintenance of biological viability for future reanimation, the belief that death was a condition that could be reversed with sufficient technology. You think Michael Jackson's body was taken there for preservation? For possible future reanimation? Pritchard's expression was haunted. I think someone paid enormous amounts of money to ensure that Michael Jackson's remains were preserved under optimal conditions, away from the public cemetery where environmental factors and time would naturally cause decomposition. I think the bronze casket at Westwood contains either nothing or substitute remains that can't be identified. And I think this was all arranged before Michael even died. The pieces were clicking together in Marcus's mind with horrible clarity. The meetings between Wexler and Dr. Murray, the contingency planning, the natural conclusion of our arrangement. They were preparing for Michael's death because they knew it was coming. Not because they planned to kill him, but because they knew his condition was deteriorating and they needed to be ready to implement this preservation protocol immediately after death, before decomposition could begin, before the body became useless for whatever purpose they had in mind. Nina had stopped writing and was staring at the wall, her face pale. This isn't just a conspiracy about a burial. This is about someone trying to preserve Michael Jackson's body for future reanimation. That's what the $6 million bought. Not security, not crisis management, but the immediate preservation and ongoing maintenance of remains in the hope that someday, somehow, technology would advance enough to bring him back. She looked at Pritchard. Who would do this? Who had the authority, the money, and the motivation? Pritchard pulled up another document on his computer, a legal filing from the Michael Jackson estate. After Michael died, his estate was valued at over $1 billion when you factor in future earnings from music rights, the Beatles' catalog, and other holdings. But there was a problem. Michael's children were minors. Control of the estate went to executors and trustees who made decisions about the legacy, the business, everything. One of those executors was John Branca, Michael's attorney. Another was John McClane, a music executive. Both had enormous financial incentive to keep the Michael Jackson brand alive and profitable. He pointed to specific sections of the document. But there's a clause in the estate documentation that I didn't understand until years later. It specifies that a portion of estate funds be allocated to medical and scientific research aimed at preservation of cultural legacies. Vague language that could mean anything. But when you combine it with the payments to Sentinel Strategic Services, the relationship with the Prometheus Institute, and the secret burial arrangements, it starts to look like someone was using estate money to preserve Michael's body with the eventual goal of bringing him back. Not as a tribute, not as memorabilia, but actually bringing him back to life. Marcus felt like the world had tilted off its axis. That's insane. That's science fiction. You can't bring people back from the dead. Pritchard's smile was grim. Not yet, but cryonics is based on the principle that what we call death is just a state we haven't learned to reverse. People pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to have their bodies preserved at the moment of death in the hope that future medicine will cure whatever killed them and revive them. It's not mainstream, but it's not crazy fringe science either. And if you're managing an estate worth billions, and you believe that Michael Jackson could literally return someday to continue generating revenue, reclaim his legacy, and erase the circumstances of his death, wouldn't you make that investment? Nina stood and began pacing, thinking through implications. If this is true, if Michael Jackson's body had been preserved for 16 years at this Prometheus Institute with the goal of eventual reanimation, then there are people who have been protecting this secret because exposing it would destroy everything. The estate could be sued. The executors could face criminal charges. And every decision they've made about Michael's legacy for 16 years will be called into question. This isn't just about respecting the dead. This is about money, power, and a delusion that borders on religious faith. Marcus thought about the threat he had received, the distorted voice warning him to return the files. Wexler isn't the only one who wants this buried. The estate, the executors, anyone associated with the Prometheus Institute, they all have reasons to keep this secret. When Kellerman's insurance policy was triggered and the footage was leaked, it threatened to expose everything. So they are trying to contain it, to threaten anyone who has access to the evidence, to maintain the fiction until they can figure out a permanent solution. Pritchard nodded, pulling out his phone. I've been in contact with a person who received Kellerman's insurance policy. I didn't tell you before because I needed to make sure you were legitimate, that you weren't working for Wexler. The person's name is Rebecca Kellerman, David's daughter. She's 24 years old, studying law at UCLA. Her father left her a safety deposit box with instructions to open it if he died under suspicious circumstances. Inside was a copy of the forbidden footage, his own notes, and a letter explaining everything he knew. She tried to go to the police 3 weeks ago, but they dismissed her as a grief-stricken daughter chasing conspiracy theories. So she leaked some of the footage online, hoping to force an investigation. Nina grabbed her phone. We need to contact Rebecca immediately. If she has her father's notes, and we have your notebook, and Sarah has the financial records, and Marcus has the original footage, we have enough to force a real investigation. But we need to coordinate, to go public all at once so they can't silence us one by one. Pritchard was already dialing, putting the call on speaker. A young female voice answered after 2 rings, tense and guarded. Hello. Rebecca, it's James Pritchard. I'm with 2 people who can help us. Nina Vasquez, the journalist, and Marcus Chen, who works at Westwood. We're ready to go public with everything. But we need to do it smart. We need protection, and we need irrefutable evidence. There was silence on the line, then the sound of quiet crying. My father died because of this. They murdered him and made it look like an accident. I want them to pay. I want everyone to know what they did. Nina spoke gently but firmly. They will pay, Rebecca, but only if we survive long enough to tell the story. I have a contact at the FBI, someone who specializes in complex fraud and conspiracy cases. If we give her everything we have, she can open a formal investigation with subpoena power and witness protection. But we need to move fast. Once we make contact with federal authorities, Wexler and his employers will know their time is up. They'll either run or eliminate loose ends. We can't give them that chance. Marcus looked at the faces around him. Pritchard haunted by his complicity, Nina energized by the prospect of the story of her career, Rebecca's voice filled with grief and determination. What about Michael Jackson's family? Don't they deserve to know that their father's body isn't where they think it is? Don't they deserve to decide whether to bring this public? Pritchard's expression softened. That's the most complicated part of all this. What if some of them know? What if some of them approved of the preservation plan, believing they were honoring Michael's legacy and ensuring his possible return? How do you tell someone their grief was manipulated, their memorial was a lie, but it might have been done with partial family consent? Nina pulled out her laptop, creating a strategy document on the screen. We tell the truth. All of it. We provide evidence. We let investigators determine who knew what and when. Our job isn't to protect anyone's feelings or legacy. Our job is to expose what happened so that justice, whatever form it takes, can be served. Michael Jackson was a human being who died under tragic circumstances. He deserves to rest, truly rest, not be preserved like a specimen in the hope of some science fiction resurrection. And his family deserves to know the truth, however painful it might be. Over the next 6 hours, they worked together to compile everything they had. Marcus copied the forbidden footage onto multiple drives. Nina scanned all of Sarah Chen's documents. Pritchard provided his detailed notebook and the contacts he had maintained for his own insurance purposes. Rebecca sent her father's materials digitally, along with additional information she had uncovered in her own investigation. By midnight, they had a comprehensive package of evidence that told a story of conspiracy, deception, and a plan so audacious it seemed impossible. Nina made the call to her FBI contact at 6 a.m., waking the prosecutor with an apology and a promise that what she was about to hear would justify the early morning intrusion. 3 hours later, they were all in a secure federal building in Phoenix, surrounded by agents and prosecutors who listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to shock to grim determination. By evening, subpoenas were being prepared, warrants were being drafted, and arrangements were being made to open the Holly Terrace Mausoleum at Westwood Memorial Park under federal supervision. Marcus stood outside the federal building as sunset painted the Arizona sky in shades of amber and crimson. In 48 hours, the truth would emerge. The bronze casket would be opened. Whatever was inside would finally be revealed. And a 16-year conspiracy would either be confirmed or disproven with certainty that no one could dispute. He thought about the forbidden footage that had started all of this, images that were never meant to be seen, evidence that had waited in darkness for someone brave or foolish enough to bring it into light. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words, truth rising finally. Marcus didn't know who sent it. Maybe Sarah, maybe someone else who had been carrying this secret, maybe even a threat from the people who wanted it buried. But the words felt true. After 16 years of lies, manipulation, and silence, the truth was finally rising. And whatever it revealed about Michael Jackson's final resting place would change everything people thought they knew about his death, his legacy, and the lengths some people would go to control even the finality of death itself. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed once the evidence was presented. Within 72 hours, agents had conducted raids on 3 locations: the Prometheus Institute in Nevada, Harold Wexler's Caribbean residence, and the administrative offices of the Michael Jackson estate in Los Angeles. Marcus watched news coverage from a safe house where he, Nina, Pritchett, and Rebecca had been placed under protective custody. The media was reporting the raids as part of an investigation into financial irregularities, but those who knew the full story understood this was much bigger than money laundering or fraud. On the 4th day, Marcus received clearance to accompany federal investigators to Westwood Memorial Park. The cemetery had been closed to the public, with armed guard preventing anyone from entering or leaving. News helicopters circled overhead. Their cameras trained on the Holly Terrace Mausoleum, where a team of forensic specialists, medical examiners, and federal agents were preparing to open the bronze casket that had rested undisturbed for 16 years. Nina stood beside Marcus, her press credentials allowing her exclusive access to document whatever was discovered. She had promised the FBI first rights to the full story in exchange for being present at this crucial moment. They walked through the cemetery in the early morning light, passing rows of graves that held Hollywood legends and ordinary people alike. The mausoleum appeared exactly as it had in the forbidden footage, elegant and solemn, its bronze doors reflecting the California sun. Inside, the temperature was carefully controlled, and the air smelled faintly of flowers and stone. The bronze casket sat in the center, just as Pritchett had described, draped with roses that had long since dried but remained in place, preserved by the cool, dry environment. The lead investigator, a woman named Agent Sarah Morrison, gave final instructions to her team. They would document everything, photograph from multiple angles, and proceed with the utmost respect for the deceased, regardless of whose remains they found. Medical examiners stood ready with equipment to immediately assess and identify any human remains through dental records, DNA analysis, and other forensic methods. If James Pritchett's account was accurate, they would find either nothing or substitute remains that couldn't possibly be Michael Jackson. If he was wrong, if this entire investigation was based on paranoid delusions and misinterpreted evidence, they would find exactly what should be there: the undisturbed remains of the King of Pop. Agent Morrison nodded to the forensic team, and 2 specialists approached the casket with tools designed to open sealed containers without causing damage. Marcus found himself holding his breath as they worked, the quiet sounds of metal on metal echoing through the mausoleum. Nina had her recorder running, capturing every moment for the story that would define both their careers and potentially reshape public understanding of one of the most famous deaths in modern history. The casket seal broke with a soft hiss, equalized air pressure, creating a sound like a whispered secret finally being told. They lifted the lid slowly, carefully, and Marcus moved closer despite every instinct telling him to look away. Inside the bronze casket, nestled on white satin, lay not a body but an ornate urn. It was beautiful, crafted from what appeared to be platinum and decorated with musical notes and images that captured Michael Jackson's career. But it was still just an urn, containing what could only be cremated remains. The silence in the mausoleum was absolute, broken only by the rapid clicking of camera shutters documenting this impossible discovery. Michael Jackson had been buried, not cremated. Every public record, every news report, every statement from the family confirmed burial, not cremation. Yet here was evidence that contradicted everything the world believed. Agent Morrison carefully removed the urn and handed it to a medical examiner, who opened it with gloved hands. Inside was ash, gray and fine, exactly what cremation produced. But whose ash? The medical examiner took samples immediately, placing them in containers for DNA analysis that would take days to process. Marcus felt dizzy, the implications washing over him in waves. If these ashes weren't Michael Jackson's, then Pritchard's account was accurate. The body had been removed and taken to the Prometheus Institute, replaced with substitute remains that couldn't decompose or provide evidence of the switch. If the ashes were Michael Jackson's, then something even stranger had occurred, a decision to cremate after burial, in secret, without family knowledge or consent. But there was more. Beneath where the urn had rested, someone had placed an envelope, sealed with wax and marked with a date, July 8, 2009. Agent Morrison carefully extracted it, photographed it in place, and then broke the seal with methodical precision. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in elegant script. Marcus moved closer as Morrison read aloud, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. To whom it may concern, what lies here is temporary. What was taken will return when science and faith align. This is not desecration but preservation. This is not death but transition. The king sleeps, waiting for his kingdom to call him home. Signed, the Keepers of the Legacy. The note confirmed everything and explained nothing. It was admission of the substitution, confirmation that Michael Jackson's body had been taken elsewhere, and a statement of purpose that bordered on religious devotion. The Keepers of the Legacy, a name that suggested organization, multiple people united in this bizarre mission to preserve and potentially resurrect a dead celebrity. Marcus thought about the payments from the estate, the involvement of executors and attorneys, the careful coordination required to pull off such a conspiracy. How many people knew? How many were complicit? And how many truly believed that someday, somehow, Michael Jackson would return? Nina was already on her phone, calling her editors, providing updates that would soon become headlines around the world. The story was no longer speculative or theoretical. Federal investigators had opened Michael Jackson's casket and found it did not contain his body. The implications would reverberate through legal systems, the entertainment industry, and the grief of millions of fans who had mourned at a grave that was essentially empty. Marcus watched as additional forensic teams arrived, bringing equipment to examine the rest of the mausoleum, searching for any other evidence of tampering or deception. Within hours, the story broke globally. News channels interrupted regular programming to report the unprecedented discovery. Social media exploded with theories, outrage, and disbelief. The Jackson family released a statement through their attorneys, claiming they had no knowledge of any substitution and demanding a full investigation into who had violated their trust and their loved one's final rest. But Marcus, having seen the evidence, having traced the payments and connections, suspected that at least some family members knew more than they were admitting. The question was whether they had approved the plan or were victims of it. The raids on the Prometheus Institute yielded their own revelations. Federal agents discovered extensive cryogenic facilities, far more sophisticated than the Institute's public face suggested. In a secured chamber requiring multiple levels of clearance, they found 12 preservation units, each containing human remains maintained at temperatures near absolute zero. One unit was marked with a name that made headlines around the world, Michael Joseph Jackson. Inside, preserved with technology that represented millions of dollars of investment, was a body that dental records and preliminary DNA analysis confirmed was indeed the king of pop. He had been here for 16 years, frozen in time, waiting for a resurrection that science could not yet provide. Harold Wexler was arrested attempting to leave his Caribbean island on a private yacht. He invoked his right to remain silent and hired a team of lawyers that immediately began negotiating for immunity in exchange for testimony. The executors of the Michael Jackson estate were placed under investigation, their communications subpoenaed, their financial records scrutinized as evidence of fraud, misuse of estate funds, and conspiracy. Dr. Conrad Murray, already having served time for involuntary manslaughter, found himself facing new questions about his role in the preservation plan. Had he been complicit from the beginning? Had his administration of Propofol been negligent or something more calculated? Marcus sat in the safe house watching these developments unfold on television, feeling disconnected from the chaos he had helped unleash. Rebecca Kellerman appeared on news programs, her grief now validated, her father's death finally being investigated as a murder it likely was. James Pritchard gave carefully worded interviews, describing his role as an unwitting participant who eventually chose conscience over self-preservation. Sarah Chen remained in hiding, her identity protected per the agreement, but her documents formed the backbone of the federal case being built. And Nina Vasquez became the face of investigative journalism vindicated, the reporter who had known something was wrong 16 years ago and finally had the evidence to prove it. But Marcus felt no triumph, no satisfaction in being right. He thought about Michael Jackson, a man who had brought joy to millions through his music, who had struggled with fame, addiction, and the weight of impossible expectations. In death, he had become a commodity, his very body treated as an asset to be preserved for potential future exploitation. The cruelty of it was staggering. The man couldn't even rest in death. He had been frozen, stored, maintained like a specimen in a laboratory, all in the name of a legacy that had apparently valued profit over peace. The investigation expanded as more evidence emerged. Financial records showed that the estate had paid the Prometheus Institute over $40 million since 2009 for what were described as legacy preservation services. Legal experts debated whether this constituted fraud, misuse of funds, or grotesque but technically legal use of estate resources. The executors claimed they had acted on explicit instructions left by Michael Jackson himself, instructions that allegedly expressed his wish to be preserved for potential future reanimation. But no written documentation of such instructions could be found, only verbal claims by people who had significant financial incentive to continue the arrangement. 3 weeks after the mausoleum was opened, Agent Morrison invited Marcus, Nina, Pritchett, and Rebecca to a final briefing. They met in the same secure federal building where this had all begun, but now the investigation had grown to involve multiple agencies, international cooperation, and enough evidence to potentially bring down dozens of people who had participated in or profited from the conspiracy. Morrison laid out the findings methodically, confirming what they had already pieced together but adding details that made the full scope of the operation clear. The preservation plan had been initiated in 2008, over a year before Michael Jackson's death, suggesting premeditation that was deeply troubling. We believe Harold Wexler approached certain parties close to Michael Jackson with a proposal, Morrison explained, showing documents on a large screen. The proposal was simple. If Michael died unexpectedly, given his health issues and lifestyle, there was an opportunity to preserve his remains using cutting-edge cryogenic technology. The pitch was that this wasn't disrespectful, but rather honoring his legacy, giving future generations a possibility of seeing him restored, perhaps even revived if science advanced sufficiently. For people invested in the Michael Jackson brand, both emotionally and financially, this pitch apparently resonated. She continued, explaining how the plan required multiple layers of coordination. Dr. Murray's role was to ensure that if death occurred, the body would be transported quickly to begin preservation before cellular degradation. Wexler's role was to arrange the logistics, the secret transfer, the substitution. The executor's role was to provide funding and legal cover, using estate resources to pay for preservation services disguised as various legitimate expenses. And the Prometheus Institute's role was to provide the actual preservation technology and maintain absolute secrecy about their unusual client. Each participant believed they were serving Michael Jackson's legacy, or at least convinced themselves of that justification. What about accountability? Rebecca asked, her voice hard. My father died because he knew too much. How many others were killed or threatened? Morrison's expression was grave. We're investigating 7 deaths over the past 16 years that may be connected to this conspiracy. Your father's death is being treated as homicide, and we have evidence suggesting Wexler's organization was responsible. But proving murder for hire across multiple jurisdictions and years is extremely difficult. We're building the strongest case we can, but I won't promise that everyone responsible will face justice. Some people are too insulated, too protected by layers of plausible deniability. The reality was disappointing but not surprising. Wealthy, powerful people rarely face full consequences for their actions, especially when those actions were cloaked in legal language and conducted through intermediaries. But at least the truth was out. At least the world knew what had happened. At least Michael Jackson's body would finally be returned to his family for proper burial, if that's what they decided they wanted. The choice was theirs now, not some self-appointed keepers who were presumed to make decisions about someone else's eternal rest. That itself felt like a victory, however incomplete. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings became a media sensation. The estate was sued by various parties, including some of Michael Jackson's own family members who claimed they had been deceived. Harold Wexler eventually accepted a plea deal, testifying against higher-level participants in exchange for a reduced sentence. Several executives associated with the Prometheus Institute were charged with violations of health codes, improper handling of human remains, and conspiracy. Dr. Conrad Murray gave testimony that was both self-serving and damning, claiming he had been manipulated by forces he didn't fully understand. The executives fought the charges vigorously, maintaining they had acted in good faith based on what they believed to be the deceased's wishes. Marcus returned to his job at Westwood Memorial Park, though his role had changed significantly. He was now the cemetery's director of transparency and ethics, tasked with ensuring that nothing like the Michael Jackson situation could ever happen again. The cemetery implemented new protocols, multiple checks on access to burial sites, and regular audits of all security footage and documentation. It was satisfying work, turning his nightmare experience into positive reform. But he knew he would never again look at a cemetery the same way, never again assume that what was buried stayed buried, or that death meant the end of human scheming and manipulation. Nina Vasquez won multiple journalism awards for her coverage of the story. Her book, The Forbidden Footage, How Michael Jackson's Body Was Stolen and the 16-Year Conspiracy to Hide It, became an instant bestseller. She appeared on news programs around the world, explaining the complex web of deception and the ordinary people who had risked everything to expose the truth. But in private conversations with Marcus, she admitted that the victory felt hollow. They had exposed a conspiracy, but they hadn't prevented it. Michael Jackson had still spent 16 years frozen in a laboratory, his body treated as property rather than as the remains of a human being deserving dignity and rest. James Pritchard used his portion of the book and media deal proceeds to start a foundation dedicated to protecting the rights of the deceased and their families. He traveled to schools and organizations, speaking about the importance of ethical conduct even when faced with authority figures who demanded complicity in wrongdoing. His guilt over his participation in the original conspiracy never fully left him, but he channeled it into ensuring that others would have the courage he had lacked. Rebecca Kellerman graduated from law school and began working as a prosecutor specializing in cases involving abuse of power and conspiracy. Her father's death had been ruled a homicide, though no one was ever convicted for it. She carried his memory by fighting for justice in cases where others might give up. The Michael Jackson family eventually held a second, truly final burial for their loved one. It was private, attended only by close family, and conducted with a dignity and respect that should have been present from the beginning. They chose a different cemetery, a location that would never be publicly disclosed, ensuring that this time, their loved one could rest in peace without fear of exploitation or violation. The bronze casket at Westwood Memorial Park was removed, the mausoleum space left empty as a reminder of the conspiracy that had taken place there. Some people called for the spot to be sealed, to erase the evidence of wrongdoing. But others argued it should remain as a memorial to the importance of truth and the dangers of allowing money and power to override basic human decency. Marcus stood in that empty mausoleum one final time, months after the investigation had concluded. The inscription on the wall remained, in loving memory of Michael Joseph Jackson, gone too soon, forever in our hearts. But now everyone knew the complicated, disturbing truth behind those simple words. The king of pop had indeed gone too soon, but his journey to final rest had been far longer and stranger than anyone could have imagined. Marcus thought about the carved message at the base of the plaque. Truth buried, truth rising. The truth had risen, just as someone had hoped it would 16 years ago. It had taken courage from multiple people, the death of at least one innocent man, and the upheaval of an entire industry's assumptions about privacy and respect for the dead. As he walked out of the mausoleum into California sunshine, Marcus felt the weight of everything that had happened settling into something resembling peace. He had been an ordinary person who stumbled into an extraordinary situation. He had been threatened, endangered, and forced to question everything he thought he knew about his work and his world. But he had also been part of revealing a truth that mattered, a truth that said even the most famous, most protected secrets could eventually be exposed if enough people refused to look away. The forbidden footage had been leaked, the conspiracy had been revealed, and Michael Jackson could finally, truly rest. That would have to be enough. In a world where justice was often incomplete and truth was frequently compromised, sometimes enough was all you could hope for. And sometimes, just sometimes, enough was actually everything.